stand by. We are about to begin. Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for joining this Balancing Work and Cancer webinar series, Working Through Treatment conference call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode, but instructions on how to share a question will be shared after today's prepared remarks. As a reminder, this session is being recorded. And now I would like to turn the call over to our host, Rachel Becker. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jim. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for attending this evening. My name is Rachel Becker. I am Senior Director of Programs at Cancer and Careers, and I will be your host and co-presenter for today's 60-minute webinar. Next slide, please. So before we begin, a few quick housekeeping items related to accreditation. And for those of you who do not need this information, please bear with me. I will be as fast as possible. Today's webinar is accredited for CEUs by NASW, the New York State Education Department State Board for Social Work, the American Nurses Credentialing Center, the California Board of Registered Nursing, and the Society for Human Resource Management. If you plan on receiving continuing education credit for this program from any of these accrediting bodies, please proceed with the following steps. First, you must call in individually. Participants who listen in on someone else's line will not receive credit. Second, you must complete and submit the evaluation and post-test, which will be sent to you tomorrow, as well as receive a passing grade on that post-test. The email containing those links will be sent again tomorrow by 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and certificates will be emailed within 4 to 6 weeks. Also, please note that the planners and presenters of this program have not disclosed any pertinent financial relationships or conflicts of interest, and that no commercial support was provided for this program. Next slide, please. Thanks in part to a generous grant from Genentech, Cancer and Careers has created the Balancing Work and Cancer webinar series to provide patients, survivors, and healthcare professionals with concise, targeted information to help you understand a variety of issues that surround balancing work and cancer. Many people find work an important part of maintaining their identity or a sense of normalcy during cancer treatment, and it can also be a welcome respite from the demands of being a patient. Continuing to work while undergoing cancer treatment can also feel incredibly overwhelming. But with the right information, tools, many people are able to successfully balance both. This topic is at the very core of what Cancer and Careers does, and we are thrilled to bring it to you today. Presenting with me will be Monica Bryant. Monica is a cancer rights attorney and COO of Triage Cancer, which educates individuals, caregivers, and healthcare professionals on the practical and legal issues that arise after a diagnosis. Following our presentation, there will be time for you to ask questions. Next slide, please. So our topics for today's presentation are what and whom to tell when we're thinking about working through treatment, when we're continuing to work through treatment. We'll also discuss the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a federal law, and that includes a provision about reasonable accommodations, which are often key for people who are working through treatment to figure out how they're going to be able to make that happen. We're also going to talk about on-the-job strategies, as well as the Family and Medical Leave Act, commonly also known as the FMLA, which can be used as intermittent leave and is often another key tool for staying on the job. Next slide, please. So I do want to take a second to acknowledge that, of course, we are experiencing a unique moment in time right now. Unprecedented would be another way to describe it, maybe. We do have this pandemic going on, so work has started to look a little different for a lot of us. With that said, we are going to, as we move through this topic, incorporate strategies for thinking about how one might continue to actually stay in their place of work, even though perhaps many of you, if not all of us, are not actually in a place where we're able to go into our job sites right now, but we are moving closer to that reality again every day, and so just wanted to mention that we will continue to talk about that as well. And as we get started here, I wanted to present some research findings for you. And these actually come from a survey that Cancer and Careers did last year in 2019 with Harris Interactive, where we spoke with patients and survivors about reasons why they might have continued working after a diagnosis. And the top 5 reasons we found that people wanted to continue working were they wanted things to feel normal. 65% of people said that. 68% of respondents also said that it helped them to feel productive, that work provided them with a routine came from 59%. 55% of respondents said that it helped to keep or it kept their mind off of cancer, and 38% said that it would help to feel less isolated. Now, worth pointing out probably that people could choose more than one answer, which is why we see those percentages not adding up cleanly to 100%. And also very significant, I think, that 2 things that were notably missing from those top 5 responses were finances and health insurance, which is not to say that these things aren't important. Of course they are, and it is for many people the key reason why they continue to work. But amongst the topics presented, they did not make the top 5. So I think that really speaks to something that we in Cancer and Careers think about a lot and talk about a lot, which is the reality that work is so much more to people. It is tied to identity. It is tied to our sense of self. And for those reasons as well, people want to continue working during treatment. In fact, 75% of the surveyed patients and survivors we talked to agreed that working through treatment helps or helped them to cope with their cancer experience. And 74% of surveyed patients and survivors said that work aids or aided in their treatment and recovery. So those are very significant statistics, and why we opened today's session sharing them with you. And I think it's also worth commenting on the fact that as I think about who is likely dialed in for today's call, we have probably people who are in in a variety of different circumstances in terms of their own cancer experience. Some of you may have just received a diagnosis. Some of you may have already made decisions about working through treatment and therefore are experts on this topic in your own right. You've got that plan in place. And then some of you may have come to the other side and are thinking about continuing to work into the survivory, excuse me, it's been a long day, into the survival and recovery post-treatment process. Wherever you might be, hopefully we will find something for you that you're going to be able to take back to your own life experience today. And I think wherever you are, you can probably relate to the idea that sitting down and making decisions about work and treatment are going to come together often feels overwhelming. Often there are a lot of questions that start to come up. Those questions sometimes feel like they have conflicting answers, and that's okay. That's normal. So one of the things that you can do to help you really start to figure out what your path forward is going to look like through work and treatment is to ask yourself 2 questions. The first, how important is work to you personally? And the second, what information do you actually need to make a good decision about work and cancer? Next slide, please. So when it comes to answering these questions, it's often good to have some information physically in front of you to help make those choices. And this slide may look familiar to those of you who were on our Disclosure, Privacy, and Online Brand webinar last month, but we've included it again here because we think that they're really, really useful in that it illustrates the 3 buckets into which information can be sorted to help you start to make those decisions. So that first bucket has to do with medical and treatment information. Again, an area where I'm sure you are all carrying around your own very specific expertise. These are things like understanding treatment options and timelines and talking to your healthcare team about what their recommendations are so you can kind of start to map out periods of productivity and fatigue and think about how those might impact your work life. The second bucket has to do with workplace information. These include things like leave and insurance policies and pre-existing flexibility options. Some of you may be learning a whole lot about the flexibility options in your job right now, given everything that's going on. Monica is going to talk more about this topic in just a few minutes. And then also critical is doing some legal fact-finding in advance, and that is our third bucket. And this includes looking into which state and federal protections you may be entitled to at work. We bring this up not because we think it's likely that a situation is going to become litigious within the workplace. The reason that we bring up this idea of gathering legal information is because these laws that we're going to discuss today exist as tools. And knowing how to use those tools can really make a big difference in the way that you sort of carve out your trajectory through this whole experience. But laws are something that we often live in fear of. They seem complex. There's something that we don't understand. And so one of Monica and my larger goals for today is to really help to try to demystify these laws and help you understand the ways that you can apply you may be able to apply some of those legal protections to manage some of the practical concerns that you're having. And when you're having practical concerns, to help you maybe start to think about whether or not there could potentially be a legal protection that you could call on to help you come up with a solution. Next slide, please.
So when you are looking for what your potential rights or benefits might be in the employment arena, there's actually a couple of places that you're going to look. Now, I'm going to start off by saying that this is information pre-COVID-19, and there are some additional benefits that I will touch on in just a few minutes. So there are federal fair employment laws, and we're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act. There are also state fair employment laws, and these are going to provide some protections against discrimination for eligible individuals, as well in some cases provide reasonable accommodations. There are also leave laws, both federal and state. And when we're talking about an employee working under a contract, like an employment contract or a union contract, those employees also need to be looking at that specific contract for any additional or different rights and benefits they may be entitled to. Unions are a great example where in their union contracts, they may be getting added benefits, but in doing so, they may actually be giving up some benefits as well. And I've talked about some of these laws already throughout the series, but if you're looking for information in the meantime, we have several resources available on the Triage Cancer website. But I also just want to mention that if you're looking for information specifically about taking time off related to COVID-19 or paid leave, we have quite a bit of information on the Triage Cancer blog, as well as on cancerfinances.org. That is where we are providing up-to-date information about the last 4 pieces of legislation that have been passed on the federal level. I'm sure many of you have lots of questions about that. Next slide, please. But the law is just the bare minimum of what employers have to provide, and the reality is that many employers are much more generous than that bare minimum. So it's critical as an employee to take a look at your employer-specific policies. Now, typically, these can be found in some sort of policy and procedures document or employee manual. Every employer is different. Some are very formalized. Some are very casual about this. So if you don't have access to that type of document, certainly asking whomever deals with payroll or other types of employee benefits would be a good starting point. And some of the things that you might want to be looking at are certainly what are the benefits. So health insurance, dental, vision. Does your employer offer short or long-term disability insurance policies? I cannot tell you how many people I know have said, oh, my employer doesn't provide that. And I say, have you asked? And then they go back and find out that their employer does in fact provide that. So critical to look at that employer policy. Some other benefits that employers might provide is sick time. So in most states and cities, if you have access to sick time, that's because an employer has provided that to you, not because they're required to. Certainly, do they offer any sort of paid time off, like vacation time? Some employers have policies where they allow other employees to donate their paid time off to a pool that then someone can pull from if they have run out of their own. So again, all of these benefits, every employer is different, but if you don't look to your specific employer, you may actually be missing out on some really great things. Now, a really good employee manual will also lay out a process for how an employee could go about asking for medical leave or asking for a reasonable accommodation. And if the employer has already gone to the effort of laying out that process, it is oftentimes easier to just follow that process than trying to reinvent the wheel. Next slide, please. Now, in the last webinar of this series, I provided an overview of this federal law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA, and how individuals who have been diagnosed with cancer could qualify under the ADA for protection in the workplace. And I hate to repeat myself, but because the ADA provides what is perhaps the most valuable tool to work through treatment and to return to work after treatment, I just want to go over it briefly again today. Not everybody is going to be eligible for protection under the ADA. There are a few hurdles that somebody has to jump. So first, they have to work for a private employer with 15 or more employees, or for a state or local government of any size. Now, if you're a federal employee, instead you're likely going to be covered under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It's very similar to the ADA in its employment protections. In addition to working for a large enough employer, you have to be a qualified individual, which means that you can perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation. That is just the legal term for saying you're qualified for the job in question. If you are applying to be an accountant, you have the appropriate license in your state. And then finally, you have to have a disability under the ADA's definition. Now, I use the word disability a lot. It comes up a lot in my job as a cancer rights attorney, but it's important to remember that every time we're talking about a different law, it potentially has a different definition of disability. Next slide, please. So under the ADA, a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. Now, I realize that that is a mouthful, so let's break it down. The first part is that you have a physical or mental condition, and that physical or mental condition is limiting a major life activity, and it's limiting it in a substantial way. So what's a major life activity? We're talking about things that are major, things that most people can do with little or no difficulty. Sleeping, walking, breathing, eating, operation of major bodily functions, concentrating. These are all considered major life activities. Now, one important thing to remember when we're talking about cancer is oftentimes it's not the cancer itself that gives rise to the disability, but rather it's the side effects from treatment that somebody's experiencing, the nausea, chemo brain, fatigue, anxiety, that gives rise to the disability. And it could be that one of those side effects is substantial all by itself, or it could be that it's a combination of all of those side effects that gives rise to the presence of a disability under the ADA. Next slide, please. Now, we'd like you to meet Jared. Jared has worked as an office manager for a doctor's office for 7 years. He's always been a valued employee and trusted with significant responsibilities. He's always had stellar employee evaluations. His employer was even considering giving him a promotion and a raise at the beginning of next year. But in March, Jared was diagnosed with cancer. He chose not to tell his employer because he didn't want anyone to treat him differently due to the diagnosis. He took some vacation time for surgery and so far has been able to schedule his appointments around his work schedule. But he's been experiencing some side effects that have been impacting his work, such as fatigue and an inability to focus. Jared has tried to struggle through these side effects to do his job, but his work performance has suffered over the last 6 months. His employer let him know today that they would have to let him go. What could Jared have done differently? Next slide, please.
So when you're thinking through how to make a disclosure at work, there are two major things to consider overall. The first, how is treatment going to interfere or likely to interfere with your ability to perform job duties? And then second, what legal benefits might there be to sharing that information. So access to reasonable accommodations would be a great example. And of course, we're going to talk more about those very shortly. But you should also consider your work environment and culture when you're thinking about this, because besides those practical reasons that I just mentioned, there are a whole variety of reasons that people make choices to share the information at work. You know, perhaps you work in an environment that feels very safe and flexible and like a second family, and not sharing that information is going to feel really inorganic. Alternatively, there are some people who work in corporate, formal, really buttoned up and competitive environments, and they feel very strongly that they do not want to share any information about what's going on with them medically, or will only share if it becomes absolutely necessary and then stick just to the basics. You might also want to think about how your work performance has been to this point. And if you want to be really truthful and realistic in that process, poor performance reviews could be an insurmountable obstacle to getting workplace support, or like Jared, making a choice to not share information if you have really stellar reviews up to that point might lead the employer to, you know, have to guess and fill in some blanks about why work performance has declined. So that's something to consider. You may also think about how others might have been treated in a similar situation. That might give you a sense of how having a conversation about what's going on with you is likely to go. And maybe you don't know somebody who's been through a cancer journey specifically, but perhaps you do know somebody who's gone out on maternity leave, right? And how was that taken? You know, were people on the team supportive and enthusiastic and willing to jump in and pitch in, or was there grumbling behind that person's back? And then, of course, your own personality should come into play here as well. Everyone reacts differently to a cancer diagnosis, and it may be that whereas you often want to share what's going on with your coworkers, this is something that you really feel that you don't want to share. So it's your call, and taking that gut feeling into account is an important piece as well. So then, once you have decided to tell, the next challenge becomes who. For some people, their supervisor is the very clear choice. That's often somebody who we have an ongoing dialogue with, who we feel very comfortable with, and so that feels like a natural first step. For other people, they don't have that relationship with their supervisor, and so maybe it's going to HR for that conversation. Also, there may be a policy in place that says you need to start with HR and then move out from there. So these are all things to consider before having that first conversation. And then finally, if you want to share with your coworkers, you may want to think about how to kind of manage expectations about what to expect, right? Think about, maybe spend some time beforehand, have, you know, some of those initial conversations and come up with an actual plan for what your path is going to look like, and then share that information so that your coworkers feel like things are going to be taken care of, that it's all being thought about. People often pick up cues about how to react to news from the way that it's being communicated to them. So if you can communicate that there is a plan that is in place, that can go a very long way. And of course, what is very key with any of these conversations that you might be having is to prepare for them ahead of time and to incorporate the idea that treatment is a fluid situation, that often what we know 2 weeks after a diagnosis is different from what we know 6 weeks into treatment or 6 months down the road, and that a situation may very well evolve and that there may have to be ongoing conversations about how it's all going to work. And putting that idea out there ahead of time is often the better approach than, you know, coming out of the gate and making a whole lot of promises and saying this is how it's going to go definitively, and then finding later on that you have to kind of roll back some of those promises because things didn't play out in the way that you initially anticipated. Next slide, please. So the idea of starting a conversation with your employer is something that often brings up a lot of very understandable anxiety in this moment. So on this slide, we've provided a couple of suggestions for you about how you might initiate that conversation. And I'll leave you those to read and kind of absorb what they're saying. Obviously, they're not going to work in every scenario. But one point that I will make is that it is often very helpful to acknowledge that the employer has concerns as well, and to give a sign that you're thinking about those concerns, that you want to make sure that everything continues to get done and that you care about your job, you're invested in your job. And just touching on that idea along with sharing whatever other information you want to share can really go a long way to smoothing out the conversation overall. And I also want to call your attention to the fact that Cancer and Careers has created a manager's kit that is designed specifically to be carried into these conversations that you have with supervisors. It contains information about cancer, it contains information about legal protections, a whole treasure trove of things that your managers and supervisors should be aware of in this moment. So you can go to our website, check that out, and if it feels right for you, if you are disclosing at work, that can be a really useful tool to have in your hand when you go in to speak to your supervisor. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, there's a lot to discuss in terms of how one might successfully manage side effects on the job, because we do want to think about the ways that they could potentially impact our work, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But I do also want to, pause for a second and comment on the fact that there are instances where people have decided that they do not want to disclose information about their diagnosis in their workplace, and yet they find that their side effects end up sharing some information for them, right? So we can probably understand how this might happen with visible side effects. If somebody's lost their hair, lost a great deal of weight, that's often something that can invite questions from coworkers and colleagues. Often those questions are very well intended. They just want to know what's going on. But people often find themselves, we've certainly heard stories over the years, Monica and I have, about people who have found themselves in a situation where they are being confronted by a coworker, who's asking them what they've done to lose all that weight. And that patient finds themselves accidentally disclosing what's going on with them medically, whereas previously they had decided that that was not something that they want to do. So this is all to say that thinking through what some of the questions that might come up could be and how you might address those can be very, very helpful in making sure you don't accidentally end up sharing information that you hadn't planned on making public. And I'll also say that while the visible side effects can be a tell, the hidden ones can be a tell as well. You know, if you are somebody who is always very energetic and always the first to raise your hand to help organize the office birthday party or to go get a greeting card for somebody who is having a life event that is, you know, deserving of a greeting card, and suddenly you're not doing something like that anymore, those could also invite questions. So things like pain, fatigue, you know, brain fog, the various side effects that can come along with treatment can also disclose as well. So something to bear in mind as you're thinking about having these conversations at work. Next slide, please.
So chemo brain is one of those sort of hidden side effects, and it's a common term used in the cancer community to describe the cognitive thinking, memory issues that can arise after cancer treatment. But studies have shown that these cognitive challenges aren't just a result of receiving chemotherapy, but that other types of therapy like radiation or endocrine therapy can also cause some of these issues, which is why you will see that I use chemo brain in quotations, because it really is sort of a misnomer. And we know that about 60% of patients experience chemo brain post-treatment, and that there are some predictive factors like cognitive decline or age or even genetics that might come into play when we're talking about chemo brain. Next slide, please. And as more and more research is being done in this area, we're seeing that other factors besides treatment can also impact cognitive function. So things like stress or lack of sleep or medication or other illnesses. None of these things happen during cancer, right? So all of these things that can result from cancer treatment can also negatively impact somebody's chemo brain. So it reasons that dealing with some of these practical issues can help improve cognitive function and hopefully reduce the negative impact of chemo brain. So ensuring adequate sleep and appropriate levels of exercise, and of course, when appropriate, using medication. Now, Triage Cancer has a quick guide to chemo brain available for free download on our website, and I believe the link is in the last slide if you'd like some more information. Next slide, please.
So when it comes to managing chemo brain on the job, there is unfortunately no magic bullet solution. It's really about going back to basics. So the first recommendation that we make is to just let go of the idea of multitasking. And this is something that is a complex conversation. I think a lot of people believe that they are good at multitasking because we live in this society where we get notifications on our computers and on our phones, and we bounce back and forth between tasks all the time. But the fact of the matter is that the human brain is just really not designed to focus on more than one thing at a time. And the research that's been done has shown that it's really only a small percentage of people who are successfully able to multitask. So when we let go of that idea and really work on focusing on just one thing at a time, it can go a very, very long way. Also, writing down a list of priorities so that you understand what should be tackled first, second, third, sometimes having a conversation with a person who oversees your job to make sure that you're thinking about things the right way or get some guidance about what to attack and when. That can be very useful too. And then, of course, we recommend turning off your email, your phone, focusing on one thing at a time, digging in without those distractions so there's no multitasking. In fact, we also sometimes suggest for people who are interested in the idea of turning off their email or their phone notifications that they actually schedule meetings with themselves on a shared public calendar, right? So a lot of work environments that have, kind of more traditional office and computer-based setups will have a public calendar, and that way where everyone puts their appointments for the day, and then people can see, during that time I'm going to be busy. Maybe you even let your boss and coworkers know that during that time you're going to be working on X, Y, and Z project, but then at 3 o'clock you'll be back online and you'll be checking your email, and that can alleviate some of the pressure to respond. Writing things down is very helpful. Not only does this allow you to have a record of everything that you've done, everything that you should be working on, but it also just the process of actually picking up a pen in your hand and physically writing can help us retain information in our brains. And so that simple act of having that list written out, maybe copying it over day to make sure that it stays fresh can really help you keep in mind everything that you have to get done. Rehearsing any conversations that you might have before they happen. Presentations like this clearly are something that you may want to be rehearsing, but also just the conversations that you're having with the people that you work with. If you're communicating about a project, perhaps one of the things that you write down is a little script that you have so that you hit all of the major points and you know that you're covering everything that needs to be covered during that conversation. And then, of course, something that I think is very important to recognize and that's certainly been coming acutely into focus for a lot of us with everything that is going on in the world right now is the fact that stress and anxiety alone can make it hard to focus. And so finding ways to work in little stress relief practices throughout the day can be critical and often make a very, very big difference. Maybe it's keeping some lavender essential oils at your desk and closing your eyes and taking a few deep breaths to kind of help hit the reset button, or taking a walk outside, socially distanced, of course, if you're in an area where that's very important, and getting some fresh air, thinking about all of these things to kind of just clear your brain and settle back in and then start over without that layer of anxiety and stress. Next slide, please. Communication is also something that can be very useful, beefing up communication, asking a lot of questions. And then, of course, on this slide are a couple of tips for strategies around communication that can help make a difference. So asking for priorities, we talked about that before. Perhaps identifying a point person, right? Somebody who can be kind of a respite of information about what's going on with you, so that, we hear often from patients and survivors that people are coming up to them and checking in on how they're doing and wanting to know what's going on with treatment, but maybe you have somebody who's designated to answer those questions for you so that you're not having to take time away and take focus away from your projects in order to address those well-intended and very friendly inquiries. Also, knowing what your limits are and setting boundaries around those limits can be critical in these moments, particularly when treatment is really active and side effects may be kicking in, and those limitations can become a moving target, right? They shift a little bit away from what they were. Maybe we often are able to do a lot more and then suddenly find ourselves hitting a ceiling a little bit quicker. So knowing what those are and in a very friendly way, communicating that maybe we can't take on an extra task that's being offered to us, that we really appreciate being asked, but we have a lot that we're focusing on and a lot that's on our plate. And so next time, please come to us. So learning how to communicate boundaries is very useful. And then we do have a webinar on setting boundaries that's coming up later this year, so we would love to have you join in for that. Next slide, please. You also may find that when it comes to those comments that are being addressed to you in the workplace, they really live on a pretty broad spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum are the people who are, curious about how they can help and your well-being and really just coming from a very pure place. And then, of course, on the other side are those who end up making comments that don't ultimately land in the way that the person probably thinks that they're going to, and they can often feel kind of insensitive to somebody who's going through treatment, somebody who's having this experience and living it firsthand. So, for example, your boss might say to you, you've been looking so exhausted recently. I didn't give you that extra project because I didn't want to overwhelm you by adding more to your plate, right? So that's something that feels well-intended, but maybe you wanted that extra thing added to your plate. Maybe you were really excited about that project and taking it on. And so for some people, it might not be an issue. Maybe they are exhausted, but for others, it might be worth thinking through a way that you can respond. And you can see an example of what a response there might look like. I appreciate your concern, but work is a key part of my overall well-being. And in fact, last night I had some ideas about that new project, which I'd love to share with you. Right? So a nice way to address one of those comments. Next slide, please. There are, of course, also those who make comments that, as I mentioned, are just downright insensitive. And there's an example on this slide of what one of those questions might look like. And then also we have an answer, potential response written out as well. And it's rather lengthy, so we're going to give you a second to read it. But what this is really driving home is the idea that it can be useful to sit down and think about how you personally might respond if someone were to make a comment like this, so that the language that's coming out of your mouth in response to it sounds genuine. It feels genuine to you. You may even want to write it down and practice saying it out loud. Maybe if you're working with a social worker at your oncology center, that's somebody who might be able to help practice with you. If not a social worker, a friend or a family member, but really getting comfortable with having these kinds of responses come out of your mouth can go a long way if comments like this come up for you in real time. Next slide, please.
So we'd like you to meet Amber. After Amber was diagnosed with cancer of the tonsils and larynx, she decided to work through her treatment. She is a cashier at a large supermarket chain. She hasn't told anybody at work about her medical condition. She took 2 weeks of vacation for surgery and recovery. She's now in the 3rd week of her chemo and is having trouble with fatigue and is limited in how long she can stand. She also has to constantly drink water because of the impact of the treatment on her salivary glands. As a result of all the water she's drinking, she has to use the restroom frequently. The supermarket does not allow employees to have beverages at the checkout stand, and she's only allowed a break every 4 hours. Amber doesn't know what to do. Next slide, please. So Amber sets up our conversation about reasonable accommodations. And as I mentioned in the last session and earlier today, reasonable accommodations are perhaps the most important tool to help individuals work through treatment. So what are they? The legal definition is they are any change in the work environment or in the way that things are customarily done that enables an individual with disabilities to enjoy equal employment opportunities. Next slide, please. Now, that we realize that is a mouthful, so the best way to talk about reasonable accommodations is through some examples.
So we've divided types of reasonable accommodations up into 3 categories, and the first has to do with modifying workspace. So that's the physical environment in which you're actually working. And probably our favorite example of this has to do with a social worker who we worked with a number of years ago who was diagnosed with cancer. She loved her job, but she found that when she was there, she felt exceptionally nauseated. Not necessarily a strange side effect for somebody who was going through this type of chemotherapy she was going through, but what was strange was that she did not feel that way when she was at home in the evening. She also did not feel that way during the same working hours on the weekend when she was home. So we dug around and we asked a number of questions, and what we found was that her office was located right outside the cafeteria for her workplace. And so the smells of the cooking food wafting into the office were what were making her nauseated. So for her, the reasonable accommodations was to swap offices with someone else so that she would be further away from the cafeteria. Didn't make working through treatment a total snap, but it did address that specific side effect that she was having. Next slide, please. So the second bucket has to do with modifying work schedule. And so finding out whether you can work from home part-time or full-time may make a big difference in managing energy levels. Maybe it would eliminate a draining commute. And probably a lot of you have learned a whole lot about working from home at this moment in time. Also thinking about whether you could work a full-time but flexible schedule. So if you know that you feel fresh in the morning, but that your energy starts to drop later in the day, maybe your 9 to 5 workday becomes a 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. workday so you can maximize those AM productive hours. Or if you have a job with scheduled breaks, requesting additional ones could be a reasonable accommodation. Now, clearly, not all of these solutions are going to work for every job. What we're doing right here is giving you some examples so that you can be both creative and logical when you are thinking through solutions and perhaps presenting them to your employer as well. Next slide, please.
So other than modifying somebody's workspace or schedule, there may be some other reasonable accommodations that could work depending on what you are experiencing. So utilizing technology can be a great option. For example, if you're dealing with those memory or cognitive challenges, maybe using a smartphone or a tablet to record meetings might be a good option. Or if you're experiencing neuropathy in your hands and you type all day, use speak type software. Sometimes it needs to be a change in a workplace policy as an accommodation. So if somebody is suffering from fatigue, perhaps they need additional rest periods during the day. Think back to Amber's story at the supermarket. Also think about if there could be a shift in job responsibilities. Remember, I said that you have to be able to do the essential functions of the job, but how many of us do more than just those essential functions of our job? So maybe we can shift those non-essential functions to somebody else. Or maybe it needs to be completely a new job. Now, I often call this the accommodation of last resort because it's only available if there is a vacant position. So employers are not required to create a new position for somebody. But if you think about perhaps an ER nurse who has a compromised immune system, maybe spending all day in an ER when you have no idea what's coming through the door isn't the best idea. So maybe that ER nurse can be moved to an office or an administrative position or a different floor where there are fewer unknowns in terms of exposure, and then somebody else can take over the ER duties. Now, Next slide, please. I often hear from both employers and employees that there's sometimes a reluctance to either ask for the accommodation on the employee side or on the employer side to provide the accommodation, and it's often a concern around cost. The good news is we have some data on this. There is an entity funded by the U.S. Department of Labor called the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN, and they do a study every few years where they look at the cost of accommodations. And what they find is that 58% of all accommodations that are offered cost the employer absolutely nothing. Think about that smartphone. That doesn't cost the employer anything. Now, 37% of the accommodations did have a one-time cost, typically of around $500. So what we're seeing is that the costs really aren't that much. And then that study also showed us that of the employers that contacted them for help, they were happy because they were able to retain valued employees, increase employees' productivity, avoid having to find new employees. So it just goes to show that there really is a very low cost and high impact, and that this is not a one-sided benefit, that reasonable accommodations are mutually beneficial to both the employer and the employee. And so I really want people to sort of change their mindset if they're feeling like that, like they're asking for a favor, because it's also helpful to the employer as well. Next slide, please. On top of knowing that it also benefits your employer, it's also important to remember that if you're eligible under the ADA, reasonable accommodations are your right. And employers that fall under the ADA are required to provide you with reasonable accommodations, unless we can show that it's an undue hardship or a direct threat, which is a very high bar for them to clear. Now, reasonable accommodations are going to depend on your individual condition and your job responsibilities. So that's a huge component of all of this. You're going to have to look at what you're specifically dealing with and what your job is and around your employer, because what's reasonable at one employer may not be reasonable at another. It may also be that you're going to need more than one accommodation to deal with everything that you are coping with. Now, if you remember when I talked about the ADA last session, I mentioned that caregivers are not legally entitled to reasonable accommodations. That being said, just because someone isn't legally entitled to it, it often can't hurt to ask for it. As I mentioned, many employers are much more generous than what the bare minimum of the law requires. And if you think back to that JAN study, the same concepts are going to apply to caregivers. Employers want to retain valued employees. Next slide, please. But when we're talking about asking for reasonable accommodations, it does bring up a number of questions about how do you actually go about doing that. Employees should always ask for an accommodation as soon as they realize that they need one. And the rationale for that is that if the employee doesn't ask for the accommodation and whatever they're coping with starts to impact their job performance, then the employer may end up making decisions like demotions based on that job performance. Think about Jared's story. So how do you ask? You do not have to invoke the ADA or specifically use the words reasonable accommodation in order for the employer to be obligated to provide you with that accommodation. An employer really should understand what you're asking for. That being said, we often see employees being in the position of having to educate their employers. And JAN could be a really good resource for that if you are not disclosing at work. Rachel mentioned the manager's toolkit from Cancer and Careers if you are disclosing your cancer at work. Now, when you're asking for the accommodation, you could ask the person that you feel most comfortable with, but the first step I usually recommend is that you look to that employee manual to see if they've already laid out a specific process, because they may have indicated who the first person you're supposed to ask is in that manual. You also might need to take into consideration your specific workplace. So if your supervisor is your biggest advocate, it can't hurt to start with them. So again, all of that, there's no one size fits all with much of this. Now, with reasonable accommodations, the good news is that this is not a one-time offer. You've gotten your accommodation for the year, check, you're done. Accommodations can change over time as your needs change, because what somebody might need in the midst of active treatment may be different from what they need 2 weeks out. And what they need 2 weeks out is probably going to be different from what they need 2 years out. Next slide, please. So What's helpful is that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, which is the federal entity that oversees Title I of the ADA, which is what we're talking about today, has created this interactive process, which is really just a formalized term for a back and forth conversation. So once the request for an accommodation has been made, the employer and the employee are supposed to engage in a back and forth conversation. And then once the accommodation has been granted, there needs to be an ongoing assessment of if that is still working for both the employer and the employee. Now, where I see a lot of people get stuck is where to even start. I don't think there's any accommodations that could be useful for me. So in those cases, what I generally recommend is checking out the Job Accommodation Network. They have a searchable online accommodation resource where you can explore various accommodation options for people with different types of medical conditions in a particular workplace setting. So you can put in that you're an ER nurse with fatigue, and out will pop out accommodations that other people in similar situations have had. And if that isn't something that fits perfectly, it may at least spark some other ideas for you. Next slide, please. So this is just Amber's story again, and we've shown you in orange what the various accommodations she could ask for, and it also indicates that in her situation, she may actually need 3 different accommodations. So she may need to modify her workspace, so a stool. She may need something closer to the restroom, or maybe she needs more breaks. So I think Amber is a really good example of how one person may need multiple accommodations. Next slide. And when we're talking about accommodations, we just want to remind you to be very careful of assumptions. I hear from a lot of healthcare providers, oh, there's nothing, this person can't work. There's no way someone could work. Also from employees, there's no way I can work. There's nothing that's going to help me. And then also from employers, there's nothing I could possibly do that's going to help my employee. And as I hope we've illustrated, that often isn't the case. But everybody has to be able to get the details of exactly what the individual job entails and what their issues that they're dealing with are, and then get really creative. And then once there has been an agreement of what accommodations the employer is going to grant the employee, it's helpful to have it in writing. Now, some employers, again, are very formal in this process, and the employee will walk away with a written document that outlines all of the different steps and all of the different accommodations. Sometimes it's just a conversation. And in those cases, I think something as simple as sending an email after the meeting to say, thank you so much for sitting down with me. What I understood the agreement to be is that my accommodations are going to be X, Y, and Z, and that we're going to check in at Y date. Now, a couple of things could happen. You could get an email back saying, yep, thanks, that's what I understood too, which then sort of shows that everybody's in agreement. You could get no response at all, which could indicate that perhaps some further conversations are needed. Or you could get a response back of, that's not at all what I thought we discussed, and then you know that there has to be some further conversations. But getting it in writing can be very helpful because sometimes supervisors change or HR departments change. And if it's a long-term accommodation, you want to make sure that you can continue to have that in place if your supervisors do change. Next slide, please. Now, even if you're working through treatment, the reality is you probably are going to have to take at least some time off. It could be a chunk of time for something like surgery, or maybe just a few hours a week for radiation or follow-up appointments. And most people don't realize that if you're just taking sick time or some other type of paid time off, your job isn't protected. And that's where the FMLA, or the Family and Medical Leave Act, can come into play and why it's so valuable. The FMLA entitles eligible employees with the right to take a total of 12 weeks of unpaid leave per year to deal with your own serious medical condition or to act as a caregiver. What is so important about the FMLA is that it is job-protected leave, meaning that generally when an employee returns from leave, they have to be reinstated to the same or an equivalent position that they had when they took time off. and they can't be let go during FMLA. FMLA is also benefit protected. So if the employer pays a portion or all of your health insurance coverage, they have to continue to do that while you're out on leave. Now, it's worthwhile to note that not everybody is going to be able to use FMLA as protection, so you may also have to look at your state law as well if you work for a small employer or if you haven't worked long enough. The reason that this can be so valuable, even if you're working through treatment, is that the FMLA can be taken in smaller chunks of time. It can be taken in a big 12-week block, or it can be taken intermittently. So for days that you just don't feel well, or day that you need a follow-up doctor's appointment, you can designate it as FMLA and maintain that protection. So we have a couple of resources that we've listed here for you that do a deeper dive into the FMLA if you have questions about that. And of course, I'm sure there are questions about how COVID plays into all of this. And again, I point you back to the Triage Cancer blog and cancerfinances.org for a deeper dive into the specific employment-based laws around the coronavirus. Next slide, please.
So for people who do use the FMLA to take some time off, if you do make the choice to take extended time off in particular, you may have to make a series of decisions about when it feels right to return to your job. In this process, I'm going to remind you of that 3-bucket slide that we went over earlier, reviewing the information at hand, thinking about the questions that you have, the things that you're still dealing with, whether that's ongoing treatment, whether you maybe even still want to work at the job that you have. Considering all of those as you're making your choice to return back into the workplace. Next slide, please. Again, looking at the kinds of entitlements that are available can help you. Given the time, I'm going to skip through this slide as well. Next slide, please. And talk about the fact that, again, we spent some time earlier discussing comments, but often there are cancer-specific comments that come up when somebody is returning to their job after time away. How are you feeling is a question that comes up often, which is often this kind of benign question that you may not feel like, could really be anything. Somebody could answer by saying, well, I'm actually really hungry right now. I'm looking forward to lunch in an hour, what have you. But often when it's asked, it's pretty clear that they're asking, how are you feeling with everything that's going on? How are you feeling with the cancer? And if you find yourself in a moment where you don't really want to talk about it, we recommend a verbal technique that's called the SWIVEL. And so that involves acknowledging the comment that was made, putting the word "and" in there, and then swiveling the conversation back around to an area where you feel comfortable communicating. So if somebody was to say to you, my uncle had cancer, you might respond by saying, I'm sorry to hear that. That must have been very difficult. And while I have you standing here, actually, I have some questions about that project that we've been working on. Do you have a second to chat? And that really just puts the ball back in your court. Again, people tend to pick up on conversations based on what's being shared by the person who's talking. And so that's a great way to kind of take control back in that moment and keep a conversation moving forward in a way that is not focused on your health. Next slide, please.
So if you're returning to your former job, there are going to be some things to think about, and they're very similar to what we've already talked about today. So are you going to disclose? Could ADA reasonable accommodations be useful? Would intermittent leave through the FMLA or a state law be useful? And then certainly how much you have to share if you're going to avail yourself of reasonable accommodations or medical leave. Next slide, please. Employers are entitled to ask for a medical certification form, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're entitled to your exact diagnosis. And if you want some more information about sort of all the things to think about around disclosure, I suggest that you go back and listen to the first webinar of this series or check out the Triage Cancer Quick Guide on Disclosure because you do have some rights and some ability to keep the specific diagnosis private while still availing yourself of reasonable accommodations or medical leave. Next slide, please.
So that brings us to the end of our content for today. I do see that we have a couple of questions in the chat box, so we'll look to address those in just a moment. In the meantime, we have some additional resources listed for you here where you can learn more about employment rights and options and to get some legal assistance. Next slide, please. I will also mention that we have some number of webinars still upcoming as part of this series. Occupational therapy and vocational rehab is taking place on June 3rd. So if you're not registered for that, I encourage you to do so. Next slide, please. We also have a number of virtual events related to COVID-19 that we are hosting at the moment. One of them that's on this slide actually happened yesterday. I apologize for including that. But we do have an Ask the Expert session tomorrow with a career coach, as well as a webinar on job search strategy during COVID-19 next week, and then another session with a social worker about some of the issues that we may be facing in terms of stress and whatnot during this moment in time. So you can find more information about those on our website. And next slide, please. We are also hosting our National Conference on Work and Cancer this year as a virtual event. That will take place on Friday, June 19th. We will be hosting that via Zoom. Phone options are also available for those of you who may not have computer access. So please, again, visit our website or pick up the phone and give us a call if you would like to register for one of those events. Let's skip through the next slide and get to Monica and my contact information. We may not be able to get to everyone's questions today just because of where we are in terms of time right now. So if we do not get to your question, please do feel free to shoot us an email. This is just the beginning of a conversation for us, and we will do our best to get back to you with responses as soon as we can. Next slide, please. And for those of you who are requesting CEUs, I'm going to leave that up there for a moment, the information on how to get those. We will be sending out an email tomorrow with links to the evaluation and post-test. And Jim, if you can tell us very quickly how the Q&A is going to work, we will then turn to answering some of these questions.
Rachel, thank you. I'd be happy to. To our phone audience, if you prefer to ask your question live, simply press star and 1 on your telephone keypad. Pressing star and 1 will place your line into a queue. And a friendly reminder that if you're joining us tonight on a speakerphone, please return to your handset prior to pressing star and 1 to be certain that your signal does reach our equipment. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, that is star and 1 if you would like to ask a live question.
Thank you so much, Jim. I do see the first question that we have in the Q&A box here comes from Amy. I saw this question pop up earlier in the session, Amy. She was asking at the very, very beginning when I was presenting the findings of our study from that Harris survey, she said how many respondents referred to keeping health insurance as something that was a driver for them to continue working. And in a moment where Monica was talking, I actually went and pulled up the findings of that research so that I could have an answer for you, and the answer is 40%. So it was 40, flat 40. We have another question in the Q&A box as well that's coming from Liz. She says, in completing an application, do we state that we have a disability or not? Technically, having cancer is defined as having a disability. Is that correct? So I assume that Liz is asking about online job applications. And Monica, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, so first of all, we can't classify anybody who's been diagnosed with any type of cancer as having a disability that gives rise to a disability under the ADA. But what we do find is there are a lot of paper applications, online applications that ask someone to click a box about demographic information, so age, gender, disability status, and sometimes that's just about demographics. Sometimes that's about an employer gives preference to individuals with disabilities. But this really, again, is not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer, and it's going to depend on what you feel comfortable disclosing. Generally speaking, what we suggest is that if somebody does not want to disclose, that they select prefer not to answer for all of those demographic questions, so the gender, the age, because if you answer all of them and leave that one blank, or say I prefer not to answer for that one, that could raise some red flags. But also, if you don't have prior knowledge that a specific employer gives preference to individuals with disabilities, it may be to your benefit based on the studies to prefer not to answer in that application. And then if you do want to disclose at a later date, think through that process.
Great. Thank you, Monica. Jim, do we have anyone on the phone line?
In fact, we do. We'll take our first question from Boris. Please go ahead. Your line is open, sir.
Hello, my name is Boris Klansky. I'm a school social worker with the Board of Education for almost 24 years. And my private practice is much longer in 3 countries, 3 continents. So when I was attending your seminar last year, and the nutritional part was very interesting, but I would like to contribute to that part as a presenter or to prepare material, how to cook, how to understand, simple things in simple terms, practical, simple, inexpensive, and very helpful. If you don't have my information, I can give you my phone number or email or.
So, Boris, I think rather than having you, thank you so much for your question. And I think rather than having you share your information right now, because we are going to post this report.
No, not now. Absolutely not. Maybe for the next year, for the next presentation.
No, I understand. I was merely suggesting that instead of sharing your information with us right now, why don't you send us an email at cancerandcareers.org? Okay?
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Who should I address it to?
You can send it to me, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Boris. Once again, to our phone audience, if you do have a question, that is star and 1 on your telephone keypad, ladies and gentlemen. Rachel will allow just another few seconds for our phone callers.
Well, I think actually we're about 10 minutes after the hour at this point. My clock now says more than that. So in the best interest of letting everyone get along with their evening, I'm going to say that we end it here. Thank you all so much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at our future events, perhaps even tomorrow on our Ask the Experts with our career coach, Kathy Flora. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening.